Luke's Gospel. And verse 18. What's just happened in the story, Jesus has just fed the multitude by multiplying the bread and the fish. And now, after that situation, it says in verse 18, it came to pass as he was praying, his disciples were with him. And he asked them, saying, Whom do the people say that I am? And they answered and said, John the Baptist. But some say, Elias. And others say that one of the old prophets is risen again. In verse 20 says, He said to them, But whom say ye? Or whom do you say that I am? And it's interesting here, in the previous verse when he said, Whom do the people say that I am? It said they answered, meaning the group of the disciples. But then when he said, Who do you say? Made it very personal. They all got very quiet. And then it says only Peter, or it implies that only Peter. They all became very quiet then. And Peter, who doesn't seem to be afraid to go out on a limb, just spoke right up and said, the Christ of God. He said, Who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said, the Christ of God. I think, and I'm going to go on reading here in a moment, but let me talk about this first. It's interesting that Jesus seems to be wanting and desiring to move them. They were all quick to answer, and they knew who the multitude and who the crowd said. But Jesus wanted to move them past sort of a consensus theology and what is everybody else saying to a very personal kind of relationship. Who do you say? Who do you say that I am? I've found in my own life, as a matter of fact, I listen to everybody there is to listen to, and I'm always blessed by everyone that I can find that's good, and I've listened to lots of different people. But I've found that when, as they say, as the expression goes, when the rubber meets the road, you know what that means when we say when the rubber meets, when it gets down to the real essence of the crises in life and the reality of life, I can't live in somebody else's relationship, and I found I can't live in what somebody else had to say about God. I've got to find out for myself and know for myself. And what it really comes down to in our lives many times is not who does everybody else say that I am, but who do you say? You say, who do you say that I am? And everybody's got to face that. Everybody has to come to the recognition that in the reality of our lives, it really comes down to not who does everybody else say, but who do you say? Who do you say that I am? What am I to you, is what Jesus is saying here. And it's interesting, as I pointed out before, the whole group of the disciples was quick to tell him. They all knew what everybody was saying. They were well aware of what the crowd was saying and what the consensus was. But Peter seems to be the only one who was brave enough to say, you are the Christ of God. Now when he said that, this expression, Christ, it's not Jesus' last name, it's like a title. When Christ it means the anointed one. The word Christ actually literally means anointed. And it had a lot of connotations in Israel in the first century. All throughout the Old Testament there were various prophecies concerning someone who was to come. And he's called at various times through the prophets. God calls him my servant. He calls him mine anointed. He calls him in some places my son. Last week, as you know, because I mention it all the time, I do a prison service at the prison here, BJCC, and one of the men came up afterwards, and he was kind of confrontational in a way. You can tell when people have a kind of an attitude, And he said, I would just like for you to show me, if you can, anywhere in the Old Testament where God says He's going to send His Son. And I thought by that he meant, where are the prophecies of, that God was going to send Jesus? And I started turning to different places, and there are a lot of those. In fact, it's just full of it. It's just, when you're aware of that, in the very beginning in Genesis, right after Adam and Eve sinned, the very first thing God said is, I'm going to send a seed of the woman. The woman's seed will bruise the serpent's head. And that's a prophecy of Christ. But then I found out that wasn't really what he was interested in. He wanted to see in print where it said S-O-N, the word son, where there was a predicted or prophesied the son. God called him the Son. And there's one of those. I don't know how, there's not as many of those where he actually says that, but in the second Psalm. In fact, let's just read that just for a second. I just want to show you where he says Christ and anointed there. Psalm number 2. Well, why don't you put it up on the screen here, and we'll just read it. Psalm number 2, right off the bat. And then I discerned from this question that this man had been hanging around the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they make a big issue of that. And I don't want to be mean to anybody, but that's not, they sort of demean Christ. They demean Jesus and make him a secondary figure. And that's some of their theology. But here it is in the, could you give me Psalm number 2, Anton? Oh, yes. This is by David, and it's a prophetic psalm. David was a prophet. Jesus called David a prophet, so we could safely say this is a prophetic psalm. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Now stop right there. When it says anointed, this is the word that's translated in the Greek language, Christ. This is the word Christ. So it says that the kings of the earth are taking counsel together against the Lord. And when it's in all capitals like that, it's the formal name for God, Jehovah, against the Lord Jehovah and against his anointed. Now he mentions the Lord and his anointed, or his Christ, in other words. Okay, saying, go ahead. Let us break their bands asunder and cast their cords from us. Go ahead. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. That's an interesting thought to think about God sitting in there. I think maybe he looks around at what goes on earth and laughs at a lot of things. That's my opinion. But in other words, he's not disturbed at all that the kings of the earth are taking counsel together against him and against his Christ. He looks at them and he just has a little chuckle. Probably doesn't even merit a big laugh, a little chuckle. He sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. You know what that means? In derision, it means doesn't even take him seriously. He holds them in derision. Okay, verse 5. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. Go ahead. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill in Zion. See, so far he's said the Lord has an anointed, a Christ, and he calls him a king. He said, I've set my king upon my holy hill in Zion. Okay. I will declare the decree, the Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. So if anybody ever asks you, where is there a prophetic scripture that says God's going to send his son, here's one, pretty clear one. He's talking about his anointed, his Christ, in other words, and he's going to be his king, set in his holy hill in Zion. And then it says, the Lord will declare the decree, the Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. As we go on reading, you'll see it's pretty clear that he's talking about this anointed, this Christ. He calls him his son. He says, I'm going to set you up as my king in Zion. Go ahead, let's read the rest of it. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. In other words, a pretty powerful king. Okay? Be wise now, therefore, O ye kings. Be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Okay? Kiss the Son. Notice this. Again, he's talking about his son. He said, if you fear the Lord, and you should, and you're trembling and you have this kind of respect and awe for the Lord, then here's what you should do. Kiss the Son. In other words, make sure you're in good standing with the Son. You see, the Son, the anointed, the king that he set on his holy hill that will rule. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and ye perish from the way when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. Good advice for us. Now, people like Peter knew scriptures like this. Jews and people in Israel in the first century knew who the Christ was. And they knew it was someone that was predicted in Old Testament prophecies, just like the one I read to you. Anton, you can go back again now to Luke chapter 9. Give me Luke chapter 9, verse 20, and we'll take up there again. People knew about these kinds of verses, and this isn't the only one. There are many prophetic predictions of an anointed one. He's sometimes called the Son of Man. He's sometimes called my servant. He's called the Christ. And it was expected from verses like we just read, he will be a king, a ruler. And what they were looking for from this anointed one is to come as a king, as a ruler with a sword in his hand. And it's clear why they thought that. You would get that impression from some things that we would read, that this anointed one sent by the Lord would come in a very forceful, ruler kind of a way. And now Peter says here, when Jesus said, who do you say that I am? Personally, who do you say? Peter said, you are the Christ. Now this is interesting that he calls him that, because I'm sure sitting there around the campfire with their meager means and situation. He didn't look like a king. He didn't look like a ruler. And Peter, though, identifies him. He says, you're the one that they're talking about. You're the one predicted in the Old Testament. You are the anointed one. You are the Christ.